Day one of the NBA is not yet in the books when I'm recording this, but it's time to look at day two already. And holy cow, we go from having 2 games to having just a shit ton of games. So we're going to need to move through them a lot quicker than what I did yesterday, which is the plan. There's a few I'll spend a little more time on, but a lot of these I'm going to move fairly quick. Couple things up front in terms of how I'm approaching this. The reality is, going into these first games, we don't have tons of information, especially when there are teams that have had a lot of turnover in the offseason. So you're going to hear me looking at a few things primarily. One is I definitely will be looking at what those changes were that were made to the roster in the offseason and how those might affect the team overall. So there are some teams I'm definitely higher on going into the season and some I'm lower on, and I'm taking that into account heading into the first game because we don't have tons of data to go off of. Secondly, I will talk about injuries. I'll just include that with the changes to the roster. Secondly, I do look at the preseason. I talked about this a little yesterday, so I won't dwell on it. I'm not putting tons of weight on the preseason, but it is a data point that we have to look at. And I think you can tell a little bit about how a team is gelling. Do they have some places where they've popped during the preseason? Are there guys getting minutes, that kind of stuff? So I will bring it up and I will talk about it a little bit. In a couple cases, I will talk about how the start teams got off to last year, though that is few and far between. Talk about matchups, and I will talk about trends at the end as well. Like I said yesterday, that is not a primary thing for me, but it is something that I look at the end as something that can help me confirm what I'm looking at or steer me away from it. You know the drill. Hit the like button. Subscribe even. Review the podcast. Subscribe to that too. And with that, let's get into the games. First up, we got, I was going to say a stinker, but maybe not. Orlando and Detroit. I actually think both of these teams are relatively interesting heading into the season. They both had their bright spots last year, though. For Orlando, they were a little bit fewer and far between, but Detroit played well at the end of the year. Cade Cunningham showed a lot of promise. Orlando had a nice draft. They have a lot of good young players. So this is one of those games I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because the punchline here is that I don't really like anything in this game. But let me just run through a few things in case you're interested in betting this game. Bagley III is going to be out for Orlando. We have no idea what kind of role he's going to play. For Detroit, Fultz, Isaac, and Harris are all out in this game. Oh, I switched that around. Sorry. As I was reading that, I was like, those guys are not on that team. So flip it. Bagley III out for Detroit. Fultz, Isaac, Harris out for Orlando. That makes a lot more sense. First 10 games last year were rough for both of these teams, but we also know that they were both very young and even had some injuries. They both went 2-8. Orlando had a minus 8.6 margin of victory, while Detroit had minus 10.3, so even worse. I expect both of them to get off to a little bit better start than that, though both of these teams may also be in that tank to the bottom of who can get the best draft picks. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the playing time that's allotted and who's playing and how hard they're going. Those are the kind of things that make me want to stay away from this game. Orlando averaged 107 points a game in the preseason. Detroit scored 117, 107, 99, 111 in the preseason. So neither of them incredibly high scoring. In their last 2 games against each other last year, and again, these rosters are somewhat different, 134, 120 Detroit and 119, 103 Orlando. So if anything here, you could say that you want to look to an over because the last 2 games last year both went over, but neither of these teams tend to score a ton. So I think that line's probably set about where it should be. And then on the spread, again, I think it's probably set about where it should be. I think these are 2 teams that might be in the same ballpark actually this year. We'll see how that ends up playing out. So it's a stay away for me, but there's a few stats for you on that one. Next up, we have the Washington Wizards versus the vaunted Indiana Pacers, who all teams will fear when they face them this year. For Washington, Corey Kispert's going to be out. Indiana does not have any injuries of note. There is a lot of turnover, especially to the Washington roster. So they lost KCP, Ish Smith to the Nuggets, Thomas Bryant, to the Lakers, Raul Neto, who he played a decent amount, partly because of some injuries. But they did make some additions too. They got Will Barton back from the Nuggets, who is a decent player. I've said before, I like Will Barton, can create his own shots, pretty versatile. They got Taj Gibson, the corpse of Taj Gibson, Monte Morris also from the Nuggets, and then DeLon Wright. So I like what Washington did in the offseason. I don't know if they really got better or worse, but they probably at least stayed the same. And Bradley Beal signed a new contract. We'll see what he can come through with out of that contract. For Indiana, they have James Johnson and Daniel Tice. So I'm not telling you every roster move these teams made. You know that it's rough when what I have to tell you is they got James Johnson and Daniel Tice. That's the news. They lost Malcolm Brogdon, of course, to the Celtics. The preseason for these two, Washington went 1-3. Indiana went 2-2. Indiana scored around, in the one teens on average. Washington, 95, 116, 89. Now, part of the reason I bring that up is Washington at times really struggled to score the ball last year too. So we'll see if that carries over into this year with Beal, Porzingis, Barton. I mean, they do have Avia. They do have some people who I think can score some, but it's just hard to know what to expect from this team. I think they're a team that could be in the running for a play-in spot, at least fighting for that, while Indiana is absolutely one of those tank to the bottom kind of teams. So in this game, what it comes down to for me is Indiana is a complete fade team for me this year, and Washington is a team that I think could be just below average in the league, not terrible. And so I'm going into this one liking Washington -1.5. I do have a bet on that. And I would lean under 227.5. I know that could seem a little weird because Indiana didn't play any defense toward the end of last year and everybody went off on them. But we'll see what Washington does this year. They played slow last year and they didn't score a lot of points. And I'm not sure Indiana has the scorers to be able to put up as many points as they did at the end of last year. So I could see this game remaining relatively low scoring and fairly putrid. But I liked Washington -1.5, enough to play it. So I went with that. Game number 3. We got Memphis and the Knicks. The Knicks are traveling to Memphis, where Memphis is -6.5. 226.5 total. By the way, I know that some of these lines will not be the same when you're watching or listening to this as what I'm saying right now. Shit, some of them have moved since I did my research. So lines move. And hopefully the information helps you to know if you should make bets as they move or not. For Memphis, Jaren Jackson and Danny Green are out. Jaren Jackson struggled to be on the court last year, and it looks like he's going to start off this year struggling with that as well. The Knicks obviously added Jalen Brunson. They also added Hartenstein. Lost Burks and Gibson, but I don't know that either of those is much of a loss. Memphis, on the other hand, added Danny Green, who's not playing, but they lost Slow-Mo to my Minnesota Timberwolves, and they also lost Melton, who I think went to Philadelphia, which is a decent pickup for them. In the preseason, the Knicks went 3-1, averaged 113.25 points per game, and allowed 102. Memphis went 3-2, averaging 111 and allowing 106. I think that Memphis is a team that might take a little bit of a step back this year. I like John Morant, but it was interesting how the metrics last year really didn't point to him mattering as much as you would think in terms of both offensive and defensive performance for the team. They actually performed better defensively when he wasn't there. Also, the way that he plays is so reckless that I do wonder, it doesn't matter for this game, but I wonder about him making it through the season healthy. However, Memphis certainly is a talented team. They showed that last year, a good team. But I think the Knicks do take a step forward this year. I think R.J. Barrett, with another year under his belt, is going to be a better player. I really like what Jalen Brunson brings to the table, which is cliche, but it's that grittiness and winning and effort. And I think that's going to be helpful on this New York Knicks team. So while I don't love them to be a great team, another team that maybe fights for a play-in berth, I do like them better than I did last year. Only trend to mention here is that the over is 5-0 in the last 5 games between these two teams. However, I will not be betting it, but just to share that. So I do have a bet on the Knicks plus 6.5. I think it's too many points in this opening game. Memphis always has that upside of running away with a game, but I think this one could be hard fought as both teams come out and look to get off to a good start this season. I would pick Memphis on the money line, but I'll look for it to stay within those 6.5 points. And I actually lean toward the under on this game, 226.5. But like I said, that is not something that I'll be betting. That's just my lean. As we keep up the pace, let's move on to the next one. The Houston Rockets, another one of these teams that a lot of people think is going to be pretty terrible again, against the Atlanta Hawks. Atlanta reworked their lineup this offseason. Obviously, the big deal is they added DeJounte Murray. Also, you might want to make note of this one. They were able to add both Aaron and Justin Holiday. So not just one Holiday, but two. They did lose Danilo Gallinari, Kevin Huerter, Timothy Luwawa-Cabarrot. I probably said that wrong. Sorry. I just wrote down TLC on my paper. That feels easier. Sweet Lou, DeLon Wright. So they lost a lot of depth. Oh, Gorgie Dieng as well. And this is the big news for me with Atlanta. I love DeJounte Murray. I think he and Trey are going to be able to coexist fine. I think he makes the starting unit on this team a lot better. But I think the depth on this Atlanta team is crap. And so early on in the season, if they're not going to run their starters the full number of minutes, as some teams may not, I think that is a negative for Atlanta. On the other side, Houston didn't really add much. They added Jabari Smith through the draft, but that's through the draft. They did lose Dennis Schroeder and Christian Wood. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I like Christian Wood as a player. It seemed like he messed up their flow sometimes, but he is a good scorer and he has a lot of length, which is something that I think they'll miss some. But with Şengün, they've got a good interior presence. I just don't know how much depth they have there either. Personally, I don't think Houston's going to be as bad as everyone says. This team has a ton of talent. I think what it comes down to is two things. Number one, do they actualize that talent in terms of being able to play together? And are they willing to play defense? If those two things are true, I actually think Houston could be okay this year. One of those below average, but not terrible teams. I don't know if that's where they want to end up anyway, because they'd probably like another good draft pick. But I think that Houston has a lot more reason for optimism than some of these other teams people think are going to be really bad. In this game, Tate is doubtful for Houston, and Bogdanovich is going to be out for Atlanta, so that's more depth missing for Atlanta and one of their better players. Not great. Houston in the preseason, 3-1. They averaged 120.5 points per game, allowed 107. Atlanta went 2-2, averaging 112.75 points per game and allowing 111.75. Houston played at a 104.63 pace during the preseason. Man, if they keep that up, there are going to be some points in these Houston games because they like to play offense and they don't always like to play defense. In terms of trends here, Houston is only 1-4 against the spread in their last 5 against Atlanta, and the over is 5-1 in the last 6 between these teams. All of that leads me to where I have no bets on this game so far. Houston was plus 10. Now it's plus 9.5. That was the bet that I thought about because I am higher on Houston than the market seems to be, and I think Atlanta's depth could be a problem. But we're game 1, so maybe it's not much of a problem in game 1. And I think the total is about right. At 231.5, I would go over if I was going to pick a side here. I think Houston, probably both these teams, can really put up some points. So I could easily see them both getting to 120. But I'm going to just stay away. Too many unknowns, and I don't feel confident on that game, so I'm not going to bet it. Next up, we have Chicago versus Miami. Miami is a minus 5.5 favorite, 217.5 total. Chicago added aging veterans, Goran Dragic and Andre Drummond. That's fine. Dragic is a fine backup guard, and I think Drummond has proven himself to be a really good backup center. I don't think you want him as your main piece, but to be behind Vucevic, I think that's a good pickup, and that'll be solid for them. Miami didn't really add anyone. They did lose Markieff Morris and PJ Tucker. They lost some depth. Both of those are just solid role player pieces that I think are negatives for Miami. Not that I'm down on them necessarily overall, but I don't think that's helpful for Miami. In the preseason, Chicago scored a lot, 125, 131, 127. Miami scored fine. They were, 110 to 115 a lot of the time. Actually, three of their games, 111, 109, 111. So right around that 110 mark. Again, we're not putting too much into that. This is one where I did look back at the first 10 games of last season because neither of these teams had massive roster changes. Chicago started hot last year, 7-3 with a +7 margin of victory. Well, Miami also started 7-3 with an 8.6 margin of victory. And with this total of 217.5, it went under 12 out of the 20 games, 10 for Chicago, 10 for Miami in the first 10 games of last season. Because Chicago came out strong last year, and I think that this is a solid team, they just sort of fell apart near the end of last year, but they were good through the first half to 2/3 of the season. I would take the points if I was going to make a bet here. Certainly Miami is still a good team. I think Chicago's a decent team though too. So this is another game that I could see being close. I have not bet it, but the side I would lean toward is Chicago with the points. And I would also lean toward the over. Man, especially Chicago. I just feel like they have so much offensive firepower if they get it going. But that is one I will definitely not be betting because I don't feel strongly about that one at all. So if you have a strong way you want to go, that's great. But I'll be passing on the total for sure. Now we move on to the New Orleans Pelicans and the Brooklyn Nets. Pelicans obviously have Zion back. That's the big news. Obviously still CJ McCollum. So a really good roster in New Orleans. I don't think they had any other phenomenal additions or subtractions. They had a couple, but they're just not. I didn't write down all of them. Just the ones that seem big. For Brooklyn, Ben Simmons is back. That's the big news for them. He is supposed to be playing. Watching him in the preseason, he looked like Ben Simmons does. He looked really good handling the ball. He's a good defensive piece, good with assists, pretty much everything but shooting. If you can get him in a role where he never has to shoot, then I think he can be a good piece of a good team. He just can't be that number one or two. But man, this guy is a large point guard, basically, who doesn't ever have to shoot the ball, is a decent piece. I don't necessarily hate it here. And I'm not high on Ben Simmons, but I think it could work. Brooklyn also did pick up Royce O'Neal. I'd say the biggest news for this game is that Seth Curry and Joe Harris are out. The Nets also acquired TJ Warren, but he is out as well. This was a problem at times for the Nets last year where they lost their shooting. Joe Harris didn't play a lot of the year, and Seth Curry was in and out of the lineup. And so I think that this should give us a little bit of pause, especially in terms of Brooklyn's scoring. It basically puts all the onus for scoring on Durant and Kyrie, which they can carry, there's no doubt. But if they have Harris and Curry on the outside where they can kick and have really good shooters who can add to what they already do, I think they're in a much better situation. Same with Ben Simmons driving and being able to kick. So I think it is definitely a negative for them in this game that they're missing those players. In the preseason, for what it's worth, the Pelicans went 4-1, averaging 114 points a game and giving up 110.8. Brooklyn went 2-2, averaging only 101.75 points per game and giving up 108.75. New Orleans has lost 7 straight to Brooklyn by 15, 8, 5, 28, 7, 10, and 5. So they've lost 7 straight, all by more than this 3-point spread. They're 1-7 against the spread in the last 8. So this hasn't been a good matchup for them. And while there are some changes, Zion is the biggest one. Other than that, the changes are not massive compared to what it's been in those recent games. Also, the over is 4-1 in the last 5 in Brooklyn between these two teams. I do lean toward Brooklyn here. I think it could take a little bit of time for New Orleans to get it going. I'm pretty high on New Orleans for the season overall, but Zion's a tough piece to just work in because he can be so ball dominant and he's really just taking the ball to the rim the majority of the time, which I think could mess up the rhythm and movement of the offense. So I think they'll figure it out in the long run, but I think it could be a rough start to the season for New Orleans. Brooklyn, on the other hand, knows what it's like to play without their shooters. They did that plenty last year, and most of the time they were playing without Kyrie when they were at home as well. So just to have Kyrie and Durant in the lineup, I think sets them up in a decent spot to be solid in this game and good enough to cover this spread. I think that I bet Brooklyn -3 already. I'd actually have to double check that because I didn't write it down. And I also like the under in this game. That goes against the trend that I shared. But with those shooters out for Brooklyn, I think they struggle more on offense, but their length and ability on defense, they don't have Bruce Brown anymore, and that is a negative on the defensive side, I think. Oh, I forgot to say they lost Brown, which does matter, but I think that this game is more likely to stay under as the Pelicans struggle a little bit on offense coming out of the gate, and Brooklyn is without some of their shooters. From there, we go to Toronto, where Cleveland will be playing Toronto. Toronto is -2.5. 214.5 is the total on this one. Cleveland obviously acquired Donovan Mitchell in the offseason, the Spider. So that is a good thing for them. I think it fills a need at that position. And at the same time, Mitchell is another one of these players that is going to have a relatively high usage rate. Karis LeVert likes to have a high usage rate. They're better when Darius Garland has a high usage rate. So how are they going to fit in all the usage on this team? What's that going to look like? I don't think we know the answer to that at this point. In the preseason, Cleveland went 1-3, averaging 105.5 points per game. And that is echoes of last year where they went through large stretches where they struggled to score but were good on defense. They allowed 109.75 points per game in the preseason. Toronto went 3-2, 114.8 points per game, and then 113.2 allowed. Matchup-wise, this is interesting because Cleveland has a lot of size, but so does Toronto. And so I don't know that either one of them can claim the same advantage in this game that they will be able to a lot of the time in terms of size. The one player who might have a size advantage given the position is Scotty Barnes. Scotty Barnes taking a step forward is a big reason that I think Toronto could be hopeful about having a really good season this year. They already have a really strong core, so if Barnes can step up, I mean, he was good last year, but if he can take another step forward at his size with the way that he plays, Toronto's going to be a tough team because they also have depth and they have size depth. So I don't think that should be an issue against Cleveland, but Cleveland has that size as well, where I don't think they'll be able to dominate Toronto in that department either. The Cavs are 4-3 in their last 7 versus Toronto, 1-2 in Toronto straight up. This is a close enough spread that I don't mind looking at that. And Cleveland, trends-wise, 1-5 against the spread in their last 6 in Toronto. The over is 8-3 in the last 11 in Toronto, which is a little bit surprising as Cleveland has been an under team a lot of the time. I like Toronto -2.5 here. I think that they are a team that should have their synergy much more down because they haven't added in a big piece like Donovan Mitchell. And I think Cleveland will get that together. But again, I don't know that it'll be smooth right out of the gate. So I would go with Toronto there. And because this total is so low, I would look toward the over. The trend pushes me a little bit that way when I was already leaning there because both of these teams, Toronto in particular, has the ability to score a lot. But coming out of last year, I have PTSD betting Toronto over. So I won't be doing that until we see more. Just stay away from that one. All right, next up. Oklahoma City and my Minnesota Timberwolves. Minnesota in this first game, a 10.5-point favorite with a 226 total. Minnesota basically turned over their whole roster, added the French sensation. He probably has a nickname. I don't know what it is. COVID microphone guy. I probably shouldn't say that. Rudy Gobert Also slow-mo Kyle Anderson, who I've never been a big fan of, but does just seem to be efficient and a pretty solid player. So maybe that'll be all right. Also added Bryn Forbes, who can be a good shooter, create his own shot a little bit, so that's okay. Lost Malik Beasley, Pat Beverly, Okogie, and Vanderbilt. The only one there that bothers me much is Pat Beverly. One of those guys that is super annoying, but provides some leadership and some veteran stability. So I'm not pumped that they had to lose him, but hopefully that'll end up being okay. Oklahoma City drafted Chet Holmgren, but he is out for the season. So we get pretty much the same Oklahoma City team that we had last year. In the preseason, Oklahoma City, they were wrecking it, 5-1, 119.33 points a game, allowing 100.83. This is the champion of the preseason, I think. Minnesota went 4-1 in the preseason, averaging 114.8 points a game, giving up 110.4. Oklahoma City has lost 4 straight to Minnesota. And listen to this. They lost 3 of those by 30 or more. The other one was by 8. So Oklahoma City has not just been losing to Minnesota, they've been getting blown out. But as we said, Minnesota's roster is different. This is not the same team. Hopefully it's a better team, but we have to wait and see how that will play out. One of the things that I wonder here is with the changes to Minnesota's roster, will they actually play lower scoring games? I went and looked at the Jazz with and without Rudy Gobert last year, and surprisingly, their offensive and defensive ratings weren't incredibly different. They were slightly better on offense, slightly worse on defense, but the differences weren't as big as I expected them to be. So I wonder about Rudy Gobert slowing down their pace when he's on the court, about causing other teams to score less because of the way he can clog up the lane, but potentially bringing down the scoring for Minnesota because you're taking a strong offensive player potentially off the court. Rudy Gobert is limited, kind of okay offensively. So I'm really interested to see how that's going to play out. I'm interested to see how much time Cat and Gobert share on the court. Just a lot of questions to be answered. If I was going to play anything in this game, it would actually be Oklahoma City plus the 10.5. Oklahoma City has a relatively talented roster. They're not slouches. Even though they ended up on the short end of so many games last year, they were really up and down. A tough team to nail down, which I think could be the case again this year. I also, I actually played under, I think I got 231.5. And to be, I mean, you can see it on the screen if you're watching, 226.5 when I'm recording this video. This is where getting ahead of the line sometimes is helpful. I don't know that I would play the under at 226.5 anymore. The under is 4-0 in the last 4 games between these teams in Minnesota. And I can see Oklahoma City coming out and being pretty anemic offensively again. Maybe Minnesota's scoring output is a little lower here at the beginning. But at 226.5, I couldn't recommend playing that anymore. But those are the factors in this game as I see them. On to the next. Oh, the barn burner of the night, Charlotte versus San Antonio. Woo! Everybody's going to be tuning in for this one. Charlotte's minus 1.5, 225.5 is the total. Charlotte went out and really tore it up on the free agent market this offseason, adding Dennis Smith Jr. That's right. They won the sweepstakes. Dennis Smith Jr. in the fold. Losing Miles Bridges and Montrezl Harrell. Don't need to talk about all that. San Antonio Spurs, similarly, gave up DeJounte Murray and Lonnie Walker, but they added Gorgie Jang and Isaiah Roby from the Thunder. So look out. These two teams are coming into the season ready to just be on fire. If that wasn't enough, LaMelo Ball is out tonight, and PJ Washington is questionable. So the one star that we would have in the game is going to be sitting, and thus we will put up with the players we have. In the preseason, Charlotte went 0-5. They scored 93, 97, 103, 94, 107. They really pushed it up there with a 107 in one game. San Antonio fared similarly, 1-4 in the preseason. They went over 100 in 2 out of those 5 games, all the way up to 112 points. Just offensive juggernauts on the court tonight. Trends-wise, the under's gone 8-3 in the last 11 between these teams in San Antonio. Charlotte is 4-1 against the spread in the last 5. I don't know how much stock we can put into that, but here's where I'm going with this game. Number one, I like the under. 225.5 is what it is now. I got it at 226.5, but I think 225.5 is fine. I don't know how San Antonio is scoring all year long. And without Ball, I don't count on the Hornets to score much at all either. I think this is going to be a slow, sloppy, gross game. And so I took the under, and then I also took Charlotte -2 because I think San Antonio will be one of the 2 worst teams in the league this year, and I'm going to just start off the season fading them. I mean, really, for me, if San Antonio is playing, until further notice, if San Antonio is playing pretty much anyone in the league, and it's -3 points or less, I'm just going to take the other team because I think San Antonio sucks. Also, once the line comes out, I will play San Antonio's team total under, most likely, because I think they're going to be going under 100 a lot this year. From there, we go on to half the game is better. Denver versus Utah. Denver -7.5 and a 221 total. In this one is where it sits now. Denver, pretty big turnover on their roster. Added Bruce Brown, KCP, DeAndre Jordan, and Ish Smith. Love those moves. I mean, especially KCP and Bruce Brown. Trading out Will Barton, Monte Morris, who are also good players, but I like this fit for Denver. They lost Barton, Forbes, JaMychal Green, Monte Morris. Utah sent away their entire starting lineup. Bogdanovich, Gobert, Mitchell, O'Neal, and I guess he was a backup, Hassan Whiteside. But man, they added Malik Beasley, Talen Horton-Tucker, Lauri Markkanen, Colin Sexton, and Jared Vanderbilt. A bunch of guys who could probably be the 7th or 8th player on an okay team. If you can't tell, not too pumped about Utah's lineup. Honestly, Jordan Clarkson is probably the player that there's the most reason to be excited about on this team anymore, who can tear it up offensively when he wants to. He kind of like that Stephon Marbury kind of thing of being on a bad team, but able to kind of crush it offensively when he gets going. Bottom line here for me, Utah sucks. I think they're better than the Spurs for sure, but bottom 5 teams in the league. Denver, really good. I think they challenge to win the West this year. We'll see whether or not they can do it with Murray back, Michael Porter Jr. healthy, at least for now, and then the changes that they made. Denver is 1-4 against the spread in the last 5 between these teams, and the over is 4-1 in the last 5 in Utah. I haven't played this game yet. I don't know. For some reason, I just want to see these 2 teams, especially Denver, play a little bit, see if they've gelled and they're ready to go or not. If I was going to bet anything, it would be the Denver side, but I may stay away from the spread in this one. And then I thought about under 221, but you know what I like a lot better? I did this a few times last year, and I want to be more selective with it, but this is a spot where I kind of like it. I like Utah's team total under and Denver's team total over, because I think that Denver has a really good offense. I mean, so basically what I'm looking at there is if it's a sloppy game and the spread isn't wide enough, hopefully I win one of those 2 bets and basically break even. But if it does, it's almost a way of betting on Denver a little bit too. If Denver ends up going off and Utah doesn't, then I can end up winning both of those bets. So there's maybe a little bit more opportunity to break even or to get the full win. And that's what I would like most in this game. 2 games left, doing pretty well. Just a little over half an hour with this large slate. Portland versus Sacramento is the penultimate game we'll be covering here today. Sacramento -1.5, 226.5 total. Gary Payton II is going to be out for Portland. They acquired him in the offseason. He got a bank for that and now will not be playing to start the season. Portland really struggled down the stretch offensively, so they got Jeremy Grant. So obviously all the problems are solved for Portland, and we don't have to worry about them anymore. They lost Eric Bledsoe and Joe Ingles, who never played. Sacramento on the other side lost Dante DiVincenzo, Justin Holiday, Damian Jones, Jeremy Lamb, but they added Kevin Huerter, Malik Monk, and drafted Keegan Murray, who looks like a pretty decent player. So I like what Sacramento did in the offseason for the most part. Murray is questionable in this game, but I really like where Sacramento is headed overall. We'll see. A lot rests on De'Aaron Fox and what kind of player is he? What kind of player can he become? But I think that there's at least reason for some hopefulness and upside. Sacramento went 4-0 in the preseason, fueling that hope for the Kings. 117.25 points a game. Here's a crazy thing. Even though it was preseason, they allowed 89.75 points per game. That's pretty solid, even as you look through preseason scores. There are some stinkers here and there, but for it to be that low across the board, you kind of wonder if Sacramento might play some defense this year. We will find out. And they have a great first game if they want to play some defense to come out and showcase that. Portland in the preseason went 0-4. Well, actually 0-5, but their one game, or 1-4, their one game they won was not against an NBA team. It was an international exhibition. The 4 NBA teams they played, they went 0-4 and scored 97.5 points a game. So they didn't even average 100 and gave up nearly 120. Dame is back. I get it. Jeremy Grant is a nice role player. But Dame's a year older. He's been injured a lot. He's a point guard who at times can struggle to get his own shot at this point in his career. He is an excellent shooter, but I do not believe that he's the kind of player that can carry an NBA team to victories on a regular basis anymore. I don't believe Jeremy Grant is that player either. I think the market is much too high on Portland. If you saw the futures article I posted, one of my favorite plays was Portland's team total under for this season. And so I'm coming into this one lower than the market on Portland, and I think higher than the market on Sacramento. So you know where I'm going. I bet Sacramento -1.5. It's one of my favorite bets for this slate. I also like Portland's team total under here once that comes out. Don't have the line yet, but once it comes out, I definitely like Portland's team total under. I think they're going to struggle to score this year again. Only trend here is the over is 4-1 in the last 5 between these two teams. Don't really give a shit on this one. Pretty set on what I think about it. Last game of this large Wednesday slate is the Dallas Mavericks versus the Phoenix Suns. Phoenix -4.5, 216.5 total. This is a game between what I think is going to be two good teams. I do think Phoenix is going to take a step back this year. They won, 62-3-4 games in the regular season last year. I really don't think they do that again. I think the league is catching up to them. I think DeAndre Ayton is fine. How long is he going to stay content? Chris Paul is another year older. How much is he going to be able to play? Is Booker going to prove to be the kind of player who can carry a team, or is he a good piece? So I'm medium on Phoenix here, and I'm sort of medium on Dallas. I actually don't really like Dallas ever, and I haven't, but you can't deny the results that they get. And if Luka can stay healthy, which is an if, they put a team around him that can complement him well, I think they're going to put up a lot of a fight this year. They did lose Jalen Brunson, which is a big loss, but they added Jaden Hardy in the draft and then JaVale McGee and Christian Wood, so they did add some size. Phoenix added Damian Lee, lost Aaron Holiday and JaVale McGee. So not massive things for either of these teams in that regard. Preseason, I kind of put less stock into. These are two veteran teams who probably don't give a shit about the preseason. They both went, or Dallas went 2-1, Phoenix went 1-2, blah, blah, blah. I don't really care. Trends-wise, Dallas is 4-1 against the spread in the last 5. And they're both over and under trends, depending on how you want to look at it. So what this comes down to for me is you have two good teams playing in the first game of the season. And so when there's two good teams that I view as relatively close, if I was going to make a bet, it would be with the points. And I actually did that with Dallas, and I got +5. It's at 4.5 now. I still like that fine. The other thing you could do here, there is the deal from last year where if Phoenix was down going into the fourth quarter, you just bet them blindly because they came back in the fourth quarter almost every time. So I did think about Dallas first half here and then watching for a live bet on Phoenix. It's hard to know if those trends will continue from one season to another, but I'm going to just throw that out there as something to watch because it was such a pronounced thing last year. And then I lean toward the under, but honestly, some of that just comes from the fact that both of these teams have the potential to be really good defensively. And for a while last year, Dallas was the best team in the league on defense with a defensive rating down near 100. And so I don't really want to bet an over between these two teams. Dallas at times can play slow as well, but that is a bet that I'm just staying away from. It's just where I would go if I was going to bet it. All right. It's a huge Wednesday slate. We got through the whole thing. Hopefully there's some information there that is helpful to you and you find some spots that you think are worth taking a little shot on. I will say also for me, I am starting out this season just with half unit bets because until we get some more information, feels slightly tricky to know what we're actually going to get from these teams as they ease into the year. Best of luck to you on your NBA bets, and I will see you soon again with NBA Daily Edge.